Churches were burning. Learning had nearly disappeared. Enemies occupied much of the land. Kingdom after kingdom had surrendered. And yet one man inherited that collapse and refused to let Christian civilization die. When he died, worship had been restored, learning had been returned, and England had a future again. And yet most Christians today never heard his name, which raises two obvious questions. Why is Alfred the Great largely forgotten, and what made him truly great? Because greatness is not always what we think it is. Many kings won battles, but few rebuilt civilizations. That's what we're exploring today. Welcome back to Everyday Reformation. I'm Nick Carter, joined as always by Pastor Brandon Scroggins. Brandon, it's great to have you back in the studio today.
Cue the music when the enemy comes in, roaring like a flood. Oh, I can hear it now. Our congregation just lets it roar. King Alfred's war song.
Yes.
We don't know a lot about that song, but it's pretty closely connected historically to Alfred the Great. So if you've not, as a listener, listened to King Alfred's war song, When the Enemy Comes In, you need to look it up and you need to listen to this episode.
Yes, it makes me want to tear down the gates of hell every time we sing it. Just the marching in it of it. It's just a wonderful, wonderful
The
song.
war chant.
Yes. So, Brandon, as we're talking about King Alfred the Great, as if our listeners have not figured that out yet, we see that most people know celebrities, Brandon. Most people know athletes. Most people know even politicians. But very few people know the story of Alfred the Great, and that's even in the Christian culture as well. And yet he may be one of the most influential Christian rulers, Brandon, in our Western history. His story isn't merely about Vikings and battles, which is often what you'll see in culture, but in society. But he was truly about rebuilding. And today we're going to explore four things that made Alfred truly great. We're going to talk a little bit about where he accepted responsibility, how he fought to preserve what mattered, that he restored worship and learning, and then also he built institutions that really outlived him. So, Brandon, as we start to put this podcast together and think about this, why do you think there are so few people today that have heard of Alfred the Great?
I'm in agreement with the question, Nick, and to frame it up, if you were to take the day that Christ and then the apostles and early church fathers died, and then you were to start the clock from then until now and take the top 3 or even top 5 most influential people for the better people in all of the world.
Yeah.
King Alfred the Great would certainly have a place in that top 3 to top 5 most influential people for the better. Arguably the top 3, certainly arguably the top 5. Why have we not heard of him? I think there's a few reasons. First of all, we have a short memory.
Yeah.
We think that what happened 20 or 30 years ago and now has become a part of our lives and culture and stories, it's just the way it's always been, or it's hard for us to look back beyond what's happened in just the last 50, 100 years. We have a very, very short memory. I think also because entertainment overshadows history.
Yeah.
We would rather idolize someone like Taylor Swift or some great entertainer, maybe actually a great entertainer, someone who's iconic. But we do forget the builders. We exalt the entertainers. And I think there's another very important reason why, Nick, we have reversed the heroes and the villains.
Yeah.
We have seen the woke mob really come out, and they have exalted people like Martin Luther King Jr., who are extremely problematic and have done great damage. The narrative has completely been reversed. Torn down the statues of God-fearing men like Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee, built up statues of men like Abraham Lincoln. They don't understand history. They've just been going with the flow. And you have that on top of this all-out assault to try and erase white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture altogether. So a man like King Alfred is not going to make the cut, but it's devastating and it ought to be absurd. This is one of the greatest stories of all of human history, and we should be absolutely outraged if we've not heard about it.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I have I have oftentimes where we've talked about, and I think a lot of people will. You just have these moments of just kind of, to me, it's brilliance. It's
Uh-huh.
early in the morning, but really thinking about why we've never heard this. HBO just I think did I think it's HBO. I don't know to tell you how much I watch TV, but a huge mini series on the Vikings.
Mhm.
I can assure you, they were nothing about King Alfred was probably
Mhm.
painted in there, and I think it's a concerted effort. Well, I believe, and you look in our culture, our history books, our and Hollywood, and every aspect of culture is to eliminate Christian heroes
Mhm.
or our Christian history. And King Alfred, when you look into it, he was very monumental in our founding as Christian history, and looking at what he's did. So if we eliminate those figures from history, then we don't know who what would truly we should would um, push put in a spot of, like I said, of branding these individuals as someone who to be looked after and build our lives upon.
And as a sort of teaser, because you're fixing to go into the history to
Hmm.
set this up, I would argue, and I would not be alone by far in arguing, that King Alfred literally saved Western civilization
Yeah,
for 1,000 years
yeah.
in the wake that followed. And his footprints continue to loom large in our worship, in our legal code, and legal
Hmm.
jurisdictional society and understanding, and in so many different ways. So King Alfred the Great, let's do it.
Yes. So let's jump into it. Let's talk why is this important? And let's go ahead and set the stage of why King Alfred's story is what it is, and how he came about to be King Alfred the Great. So what we see that during that time, England was a nation in decline. So what we see is England had once prospered, but prosperity had produced comfort. And I think we've seen that a lot of times where comfort produced weak
Mhm.
men, and weak men, or excuse me, yeah, excuse me, will
Yeah,
create weak men, and
yeah.
then weak men
Weak
will
men
create
create hard
times.
times.
Yes. So that whole adage. And we saw during that time as well, learning declined, spiritual life weakened, and the fear of God diminished. Then introduced the Vikings, where they came in and plundered the churches. They destroyed cities, and then what saw was kingdom after kingdom begin to fall, and it seemed as though England itself may truly disappear. But what the Vikings were doing, coming in and destroying city after city, or village after village, was not, it was set up by England's weakness as they began to not prosper any longer, and learning, where they declined, excuse me. But, what we saw is the Vikings truly exposed it. So, Brandon, when we think about this time, what, lessons do you see in connection between the spiritual decline in England and cultural weakness was experienced during that time?
I think there's a close relationship, but let's just unpack a little bit more first what they're up against, the Vikings. I think that there are a lot of parallels here with the Crusaders. So
Mhm.
people will turn the Crusaders into these nasty, monstrous people that we need to be embarrassed for. Now, Nick, certainly we're not going to advocate for everything that happened among everybody among Crusader history, but you got to understand what the Crusaders were up against, and this is what paints the picture of the Vikings. They are raping their women, they are
Mhm.
murdering their children, they're destroying their churches, and they are stealing their land and leaving them subjugated under absolute tyranny. Of course, they did what God calls them to do in defending their land and their people, not so much because the people hated what was in front of them, but because they loved what was behind
Mhm.
them. And so you do see a lot of connections between the spiritual decline and the cultural weakness. The prosperity that this part of the world in England, as they knew it then, had really begun to take root, but it left them soft, like it's doing to us today, and it began to leave them complacent. And then you see these external enemies only begin to then reveal these internal problems.
Mhm.
What were some of the internal problems? Well, one of them is that because they had lost hold of education, they became very superstitious in their worship. flirting with the integration of syncretism and pluralism,
Hmm.
and just very superstitious. They weren't grounded in the Word of God. Therefore, their worship was weak. Their education was very, very light. And so you don't have that strength and fortitude. And then the prosperity is certainly creating weakness and effeminacy and softness rather than hard-working men of valor and courage. And so I think you're right. The Vikings came in and they exposed it, and then they capitalized on it.
Yeah, and we see that where King Alfred was born and where the kingdom which he stood was in Wessex, and Wessex was the essentially as the Vikings came in and plunder the different kingdoms. Wessex was the last one of the Anglo-Saxon England, and if that had fallen, then England that had that civilization would likely
Mhm.
disappeared altogether.
Mhm.
So when we look at that now, let's kind of keep on moving along the way that and talk more about King Alfred himself and where he came from, a little bit about his background.
This is where it gets good.
Yes. So it's a very unlikely story. Alfred was the youngest of five sons. He was never expected to rule as being the youngest of five sons. I mean, there's a line of hierarchy there before it got to him. But he had it as growing up in his early childhood. He really enjoyed learning. He loved books, and there's a story of his mother of giving a book of to the brothers or the children who could learn remember recite the poetry, and he wound up doing it. And it just you can see a deep love for learning early in his life, and for that he was known more for piety than warfare. But move forward a little bit, one by one, his father died, and then all of his brothers died. And so all of a sudden, you have this young man at 23 years old that inherited a kingdom on the brink of destruction, as we talked about in the first segment. So he inherited these problems which he did not create. And think back, I want really for our listeners to think for a moment, a 23-year-old inheriting a kingdom that's already in decline. The Vikings are coming through, plundering and destroying other kingdoms as well. And this was the last, essentially, foothold in Wessex as the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom that was standing there. So now a 23-year-old inherits this. So when we look through this, he didn't have anything else other than do this set the responsibility for him. He could duck his head in the sand, but no,
Mhm.
he accepted it. It turns out to be a great story. So, Brandon, when we look at this, what can men today learn from Alfred's willingness to carry responsibilities that he never expected at such a young age?
And I believe Alfred was shocked,
Yeah,
completely surprised. He never expected to become the king.
yeah,
And what he begins to see is that one by one, his I believe his four older brothers
hmm
begin to die in battle. His father died, and you can see the
yeah,
first one, okay, the second, third,
oh
oh
yeah,
wow, it's getting closer and closer and closer. But what he found is that God's providence often surprises us. And
mm,
what God's providence found in Alfred's life as a young boy was openness, a readiness to rise to the occasion. You could put it this way: faithful men don't always choose their burdens, but
hmm
they are called to carry them when they fall in their lap.
yes,
And this rising to the occasion, this massive conflict. I mean, he's positioned to take over the kingship when the Vikings are coming in, and this particular corner and kingdom of the West was the only one standing. I mean, they're coming in plundering one after the other. So he had no option, Nick,
hmm
but it didn't just pop out of a vacuum, this faithfulness of his. He had been learning and studying. He had been giving himself faithfully to being anchored in truth and education and understanding and pursuing wisdom. He had also, as the story often goes, been training physically and garnering physical strength. So he's, I'm sure, learning endurance and perseverance. And so it reminds me of David, who's been out in the field, and then he goes to meet Goliath very, very unexpectedly, like Alfred. The kingship's falling in David's lap. He would have never expected it. And he says, "I will take down this giant because I've already been prepared by taking out the lion and the bear in my father's field." So Alfred had been faithful as a young man, and rather than blaming other people, he took up the mantle of stewardship and he trusted God to equip him, knowing that God had called him and providentially placed him. So he was willing to press in. And what a marvelous opportunity that was before him.
Mhm.
But Nick, I bet it looked completely daunting at the time.
Yeah, and that's what, you have my think about that 23-year-old. I mean, you're not expecting that. So how
What are
many
23-year-olds doing today?
yes, they're trying to figure out what they're gonna eat for, lunch or who they're gonna play on their
Uh-huh.
Xbox. But let's talk a little bit about some of his early, challenges and some of the essentially what I'd call for the fight for survival as a young man in some of these as in these military battles. So with that, we see that Alfred continued to face repeated defeats in his early years of reign. As you see it as just numerous setbacks back and one after another. He retreated, then he regrouped, and then prayed, reorganized, and then eventually drove back the Vikings. But there's one story where as he after he regrouped, it goes on and says that he gathered some loyal followers and launched a counteroffensive in 1878 in the Battle of Eglinton. Make sure I say that right.
Mm-hmm.
He won decisively defeat Guthrum.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure I butchered that, but from that,
Guthrum.
so what we see is that subsequent treaty was established boundaries between the Anglo-Saxons and the Danish territories, and what that did now is begin to secure the survival of Wessex, and we see that really that his defeats, his regrouping, praying, reorganizing, without that and this pivotal battle or this victory here, England, as later generations knew it, may have never emerged. So
Mm-hmm.
we've seen many kings win battles, but what made Alfred truly great was that what happened after the fighting stopped. He fought because there was something worth preserving. He was fighting for his civilization. So, Brandon, when we think about this, a 23-year-old going through this repeated defeats, reorganization, regrouping, praying, what happens when men become warriors without having anything worth defending?
Well, one thing that they do is they sit around twiddling their thumbs, wondering what they're going to be when they grow up.
Mm,
That sounds familiar.
yes.
I think one of two things often happens, and the two are related to each other. First of all, they tend to just turn to worthless pursuits. They drown themselves in an endless array of YouTube videos or just whatever the worthless pursuits of that particular generation are. They throw themselves into hobbies and sports and things that may have some value, but not worth taking that sort of life out of you.
Hmm.
The other thing is men are made to chop. They are made to fight. They are made to build. You picture a man with an axe in his hand, and all of a sudden you take away the wood before him. He will continue to chop. He's just going to have to find something else to hit. And what men tend to do when they don't have something really worth defending, if they don't turn to worthless pursuits altogether, they'll turn on each other and they'll begin to fight with each other and just bicker and continually split over every trivial issue and beat one another to a pulp. Nick, all the while we have a real formidable enemy in front of us and we're destroying each other
Mm,
over the most ridiculous of things. Men need a
mission,
mission
yeah.
and men need to build something in their wake behind them from families and churches and communities that really are worth defending. And then let's defend them and let's find some hills and let's go die on them.
Yeah, and that's what's amazing. Again, I stress the fact of being a young man, but what you just stated is that men need a mission, and even at that young age, it shows that young men are much more capable of doing than what they're doing today. It's about the expectation, but also that it just shows you the way God has programmed men to be leaders and to rule and take dominion, and it's one who has centered their lives around God, around their faith, and allows God to work through them, and allows the biblical principles, the way God designed men,
Hmm.
to exude, not be ruled over.
Amen.
So, so we see young man Alfred becomes king unknowingly, or not, maybe not unknowingly, unexpectedly. Many battles, and
He begins to have some early
yes,
victories in
yes,
those battles.
and there's much more to it as well, to the battles, and more we covered in this podcast. But then saves England, but then he has to start rebuilding the kingdom. So
And he's
go,
rebuilding, and also with time, he will bring great unity because
mhm,
England was a large collection of many kingdoms.
yeah,
And so there had to be a unification that would come, and he would bring that, and we'll get to that.
yes. So once the battles were over, the peace returned. Alfred really turned his attention inward. He believed that England's deepest problems were not um, they were spiritual and educational. So he began to attack those areas. He restored learning by instituting, bringing scholars in from into different areas into his court, and really truly beginning to promote education, and then amongst the clergy and nobles, which that's generally where
Hmm.
you're more educated individuals. So see that he restored learning. He gathered scholars. He translated books. There's 4 books, which he is very. I'm not even going to try to.
Which he himself was
Yes.
part of translating.
Yes. I'm not gonna try to, go through all those, but
Required Latin.
yes. And then what he did then was start to strengthen worship. He reformed law, he rebuilt roads, and then began to fortify the cities. So through that, when we look at Alfred and the rebuilding, he understood that military victory alone would not preserve a civilization. But why do you think he saw that, and looking at the whole totality of his situation, Brandon?
Now, the military aspect was impressive because when the
Hmm.
Vikings finally came back after this reprieve, Alfred basically retreats, but he doesn't just sit on the couch and eat Cheetos and watch Netflix. He begins to fortify the city with all of the things that you're talking about, with this infrastructure,
Hmm.
so that they could then truly fight and defend with this road system, with all of these different things, and they began to take out the Vikings left and right because they were prepared. The Vikings were shocked, but Alfred knew that that was only half the battle. Once you keep the enemy out,
Hmm.
you've got to have something within that's worth having, defending, and building. And a lot of people know how to fight. They know how to go after other people and other things. They're good at tearing down something. But
But
the whole point of that is so that you could protect and build up what's true and good and beautiful. So what did Alfred understand? He
mhm,
understood Nehemiah from the days of old. He had a sword in one hand and a trowel in the other. On one hand, we fight the enemy without. On the other hand, we build what is true and good and beautiful
mhm,
up within. And so you've got to have something worth defending. You've got to have a place of unity. And the central pillars here to build revolve around education and worship. The people have to be educated in truth and everything that is good and true and beautiful. They've got to learn to think and pursue wisdom and ultimately pursue God and the Lordship of Christ in every aspect of life, to take dominion, to display the rule of Christ. And so that's got to be a major part of it. But then the worship piece, giving honor and glory to God in every aspect of our life. So he's building. And I love that part of the story, Nick.
yes. And as our listeners are listening to this podcast, they may be thinking, why are we talking about King Alfred today? He's this figure in history. What does it have to do with me today? I think there's a lot of that we can take from his life and his works. And what we see that a lot of times, many Christians we spend a lot of time thinking about decline in our society, decline in our culture. But we see where King Alfred lived in decline. He was thrown in a position well before he was ever expected to. But he didn't just sit there and criticize. What he did was begin to rebuild. Um, how can we rebuild in our lives? What can we rebuild? Rebuild our families, rebuild our institutions, take it back from the secular culture that has we talked about earlier in the podcast. So for him, the answer wasn't a nostalgia. It wasn't despair. The answer was for him was his responsibility. So when we look at Brandon King Alfred, what can we see that he teaches us about rebuilding in difficult times?
Well, I don't know if we mentioned this, Nick, but we're talking about the 800s. So
Yeah.
we're talking about well over 1,000 years ago.
Hmm.
And what he teaches us is that we have to be willing to embrace the long, embrace the patient, embrace the often painful, embrace the often seemingly fruitlessness of our labors in the short term, because we are building and looking and laboring for something in the long term, and it takes time. And Alfred was willing to do that. He was willing to begin with worship, and we must start with the worship of the one true God, to invest in learning, to strengthen and build, if they're not there, good institutions of education, churches for worship,
Hmm.
and then institutions from which men would come trained in law, family men, all sorts, medicine. And we've got to strengthen those institutions, and we've got to think generationally. So he's thinking, the next 100 years, 500 years, and here we are over 1,000 years, and we're still thinking about that.
Hmm.
I'm so thankful that Alfred, by the grace of God alone, continued to put his hands in the dirt, and he continued to defend and build when it seemed completely hopeless. And he understood that civilization is built on a lot
Hmm.
of different institutions, from which I've mentioned, from starting with the church, the city hall, the legal
System.
system, education, medicine, all of it.
Yeah. And there's a lot of that we can take because it is without a doubt that we're seeing a battle between good and evil in our day and time, and it's going to take men such as King Alfred, or men who are willing to stand up in the battle, and to truly begin to preserve our civilization, our culture, and not truly just be merely critics in everyday life. And we see those
Hmm.
men are needed. And I want to get into, I think, a good example of, we've talked about this, and we have one in our church as well as Brian. I think Brian in
Hmm.
1819 News embodies a lot of this, where it's easy to sit there and criticize every day, but what are you doing to go out and help preserve a civilization, a culture, and bring back Christendom? As a lot of times he will talk. We see that men are those such as Brian and others who are the ones who rebuild and bring back this
Hmm.
Christian education, Christian culture, Christian in every way, and not stick our heads in the sand with it.
Hmm.
So we see as we begin to wrap up here, Brandon, most men um, listening will never rule a kingdom, but most men will never command armies. But every man has been trusted with something: a wife, a family, children, a church, a vocation, a community. Alfred inherited ruins, Brandon, and by God's grace, he devoted himself to rebuilding. So, as we begin to close, Brandon, what should Christian men take away from Alfred's life?
Well, Alfred didn't sit around pitying himself. He didn't sit around thinking about all of the things that he was entitled to because of the home and the kingdom that he grew up in. He didn't sit around feeling sorry for himself. By God's grace, I'm sure maybe there were moments of that. I don't know. But the answer to decline is not despair. The answer is faithfulness. And the journey of 1,000 miles starts with the next step. So, a couple of takeaways from him, I believe, is 1 Corinthians 15:58. Paul says, be immovable, be steadfast, because you know that your labor in the Lord, and when it's in the Lord, it's not in vain.
Hmm.
Because Paul says that on the back of an entire chapter about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. God will use that in his timing and in his way. So, tangibly in Alfred's life, a takeaway is we see his life bookended by two objects. On one hand, you have the pen. from the very beginning, he was an avid reader and a studier. Men need to read, they need to study, they need to expand their thinking, and they need to know and love truth and discern it from error. Okay. And Alfred surrounded himself with the best of scholars after he defended off and warded off the Vikings, began to translate these works, began to require Latin and scholastic study and achievement. Uh, he pressed their noses forward. He dispelled superstition. But at the same time, Alfred was just as much, if not more so, known as a man of the sword.
Mm.
He was a man of physical strength and agility and competence and perseverance, and he could fight. He could get into the middle of the fray in a physical sense. So you got mind and body, pen and sword, and everything in between. And we need to develop in all of those things and to grow up into Christ. And most people probably lean one way or the other, but we need to develop in every way as men with sharp minds to the best of our abilities with whatever God has given us, strong bodies.
Yeah.
Whatever God's given you,
Yes.
you need to leverage that and to use it and to display fortitude and courage and wisdom. That's just a major takeaway. So you have this man, he's a warrior. He's a statesman, he's a legislator, he's a scholar, he's a
Yeah.
translator, he's a reformer. What did God not use him for, Nick?
Amen.
The most unlikely of
Of
people.
heroes. Yeah. Perhaps, Brandon, that's why Alfred alone was given the title the Great. So it wasn't because he merely defeated armies, as we talked about, but because he rebuilt what others had allowed to decay. And perhaps that's the question Alfred should leave us with today. Who is educating your children? What is the worship culture of your home? And what institutions are you strengthening? Because history is not ultimately shaped by men who complain about collapse. It is shaped by men who faithfully rebuild.
And how striking that he is the only king in all of English history with the title not only king, but the Great.
Yes. That's a wonderful title to have. Well, with that, Brandon, we'll close it for today. And may we be the church reformed and always being reformed according to Scripture.